Welcome to the Procurement Software Podcast, where we aim to educate and inspire you about how technology is changing and shaping our profession. The truth is, there's never been a more exciting time to be in procurement, but only if you're one of those organizations that's embracing the change and driving new developments. And this podcast is all about giving you the tools to help you get there. So buckle up and let's get right into this week's show. Yes, welcome to another episode of the Procurement Software Podcast. And this month, we're actually going to be taking on a topic that we haven't touched on previously, but is absolutely vital when we talk about procurement software and just technology and IT in general. We're approaching the topic today of cybersecurity. And there's very good reason why I've not tackled this in the past. And that's because I know absolutely nothing about it. But luckily, my guest on today's show is an expert in this field, and it's great to welcome him to dive into a little bit deeper the topic of cybersecurity without using confusing tech geek language. So, Jano Bermudes from CyXcel, very warm welcome.
Thank you, James. Really glad to be here.
So we got put in touch by one of your colleagues and by a friend and contact of mine, Naire, who's now your head of supply chain within your organization. And when she pitched this idea to me, I thought this is a really important topic that we must tackle and that we'd previously avoided. So I think I'd like to kick this off by looking at it from a procurement technology context. And let's say I'm scouting for the procurement software market, looking for possible solutions that are out there. Let's say I've just joined as a head of procurement in a greenfield role and I've got a digitization plan that I want to execute. Other than the obvious thing of involving my info security stakeholders pretty early on in this discussion, if I'm starting to talk to vendors, what are the sort of things that I need to be asking when it comes to cybersecurity, just in those initial conversations? I'm not talking about contracts. It's just in those initial conversations to make sure that I'm not talking to a complete dud.
Yeah, it's funny because I had a request. Your point on IT is really interesting because I had a request from a colleague at a client who out of the blue was being asked about some software that was being procured just last week. And I guess what I'd say is if you want to do the security folks' homework for them a little bit and put them at ease, the things you want to start off with thinking about if you're talking to any provider, you have to given that a provider is always providing a service downstream to multiple customers. The thing that you can measure their initial maturity on is asking them about whether they operate some kind of standard minimum set of security controls and what those are. And that should, the right answer should be that they do, and that it aligns to some kind of standard, and that might be NIST or ISO or something else. And look, the second question I would ask them, and it will be really telling, is, and how do they give you attestation to the fact that they meet those controls? Because, just saying, well, yeah, sure, we adopted NIST and we meet these controls is fine for an internal conversation, but on a commercial boundary conversation, you'd expect there to be some kind of thinking about how they're going to demonstrate to you that they meet these requirements. And then the last thing, of course, is if you're going to process data, there's a very specific question you want to ask them about what they do in complying with some of the data protection laws that seem to be running rampage and proliferating across the world at the moment, whether that's GDPR or the California Data Protection Act. So I'd start there, and the answers to that will be really telling. You can really tell the maturity of an outsourcing partner by their answers to those three simple but difficult questions.
Got it. So that's a great start. We'll dig into security certifications a little bit later. I know I've got that in my notes, but before we do, some companies that are out there obviously might not even have an InfoSec department if they're pretty small businesses. And when we spoke last week, when we were sort of prepping what to talk about a little bit, we both agreed that the time that we live in, it's a blessing and a curse in equal measure, that it gives small and mid-sized businesses the opportunity to implement similar types of technological advantages that large corporates can, simply because the cost of software as a service has come down so much that you can do a lot around automation and AI without being a Fortune 500 company these days. But what technologies exist out there that can empower those smaller organizations to enhance the ability to monitor their supply chain operations and mitigate risk?
Yeah, monitoring the supply chain is a complex topic, but I think for simple businesses who may not have a fully formed IT function, to the conversation we had last week, being careful about how you select your providers and selecting, what I see really commonly in a lot of smaller businesses is cost is at the epicenter of the selection process. And sometimes if you think about investing a little bit more to select a supplier that has a better security profile, then that avoids having to do all this additional work in managing your supplier. And by that, I mean, like a great example is, some of the big hyperscale cloud providers will offer you security out of the box if you follow their instructions, and they'll offer you guides about how to meet GDPR compliance and how to meet, and that's for me the measure of a good supply chain vendor when you're selecting them is, can I meet my obligations easily? Can I meet, a good supplier? So for me, it's about selection. And that's kind of handy because if, in other businesses where you are in the sense that you've got a very complex supply chain of all manner and quality of suppliers, then yes, there's technology for monitoring that. And there's things like BitSight and Security Scorecard that can allow you to get a view into the risk that you're taking with some of the suppliers. But my best advice here for smaller businesses would be, think about security and assurance and the protection of your business in the costing. So you might want to take a step up, and there's some huge, go back 5, 6, 7 years, the fact that any small business can use Office 365, which is a world-class email system. It's a great example. You can think about that across the board in any number of SaaS providers that offer you business process with quality if you look carefully.
Indeed. And it's not just the small businesses that get hacked either, is it? There have been some pretty big scandals around. The one that sticks in my mind was Maersk when they got hacked about, 5, 6 years ago. So yeah, it's a topic that doesn't just affect SMEs, but yeah. What are the key regulatory requirements then? Well, you touched on data protection specifically, and cybersecurity as well when it comes to their impact on supplier management and compliance. And what are some of the challenges that companies typically face when it comes to ensuring that suppliers are compliant in this area?
Yeah, so in terms of, GDPR is the most famous piece of regulation around data processing. I think 2 other really interesting ones. So there's a sweeping set of regulations within the financial sector. And that is basically, in the UK, it's the operational resilience regime, but in Europe, it's DORA. And again, and then the other and last one is the Network and Information Systems Directive. And these are all kind of somewhat harmonized and somewhat aligned in what they are doing. And it's really important to understand it because that's a huge impact on every business. So even if you're not directly regulated, if you're hoping to sell services to customers that are regulated, then you have to think about this. And so there's a really prominent statement that the data protection regulator has made. And what it says is, you can outsource your processing of data, but you cannot outsource the accountability for meeting your obligations under the GDPR, as an example. And all of the other regulations, NIS and DORA, make the same statements. So DORA, as an example, in the financial sector prior to DORA and the operational resilience regime, financial organizations would just put aside capital to protect against losses. And that didn't really deal with the complexity of IT supply chains. And so when you had the Lloyd's TSB outage meltdown piece, the regulators really had a look at that and went, wait a minute, this is a ticking time bomb waiting to happen. So we need to put specific onus on the resilience of organizations from a capital point of view, but also from a supply chain point of view. And these digital supply chains are becoming increasingly more complex. So the onus is being pushed down onto the big financial institutions and other institutions under NIS to understand and map their supply chains. And that includes their supply chains, and the supply chains. And so wherever you are in that ecosystem, we're all eating breadcrumbs from the big tables. And so I think it's safe to say that we're going to be impacted by these regulations in some way, shape, or size over the next, 4 or 5 years, definitely.
Yeah, certainly in manufacturing supply chains, there's a big push now for manufacturing companies to understand beyond what is their tier one supply chain. And I think that's been around for a while. And obviously the companies that are more focused on corporate social responsibility have been keener on pushing that as an agenda, but it's been around for a while. I think when it comes to sourcing IT, particularly when it comes to sourcing cloud software, which pretty much all procurement technology is these days. If you're talking to a vendor and they say, well, someone, I'm just naming AWS as the biggest one, but any cloud provider that's hosting their platform, I've heard this in the past as well. They will often just say, oh yeah, well, we use blah, 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 and their servers are hosted in the European Union, so they're GDPR compliant. If I go back to what you alluded to in the last answer, that companies are responsible to ensure that they are GDPR compliant, and that ultimately includes, the umbrella of anything that comes out of their supply base. Well, how do you counter or how do you rebut that answer if a software company says, oh, we use X cloud service provider and their servers are in the European Union?
Yeah, it is. I mean, location is important. The problem is GDPR is not a tick box exercise. And the only time that you'll find out whether you've met it or not in truest sense is when you have to report a breach and there's a conversation with the regulator and they may have a look under the hood. And so what I'd say about that is a good starting point for a conversation. But the regulator specifically says you must assure yourself that any operations that you're outsourcing to a third party, and NIS has the same statement, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. But so it's not as simple as, and it also says that you must have contracts in place for a start and agreements in place that meet the obligations, and those contracts must have assurance pieces, and then there's a piece around actually looking at that assurance. So assurance over what is the question. So in that data center, a really common one I see is, we've got ISO certification over our organization, but we have a lot less assurance over the operating environment that your particular application is sitting in. And to your point around, like if I'm a service provider who uses a data center, which is also a service provider, are they going to let you see that data center provider's assurance details? How do you assure yourself that the entire supply chain is meeting your obligation requirements? And we've seen that just recently, with the CrowdStrike outage. What you had is a third, fourth, if I was using, let's say, a SaaS provider that sat on Azure that used CrowdStrike and nobody even knew that it did, and CrowdStrike got knocked out. So Azure got knocked out. So my SaaS provider got knocked out, and I had an implication on my business. It's my responsibility, to my customer to meet that. So NIS, as an example, makes specific statements around ensuring resilience in your supply chain where you're offering critical services, and GDPR would do the same for data process. So you need to then ask for that assurance. So, and one of the challenges you have with SOC 2s is they tend to be confidential for their end customer. So if the data center has a SOC 2, the service provider sits on top of it, may not show that service provision, that SOC 2 to their customer, because that's just the way that's designed. And so there are other mechanisms for dealing with that, but it's a complex issue, something that needs to be considered.
Yeah, I'm glad you touched on SOC 2, because I was going to ask you this next. I mean, when you go onto a software provider's website, you'll often see the ISO 27001 logo or the SOC 2 logo. We are SOC 2 certified. We have ISO 27001 certification. Anyone that's not in this space, and I include myself in this, will perhaps be a little bit more reassured by seeing that. But what are the loopholes in that? Well, first of all, what are the loopholes in terms of what enables a vendor to be able to put that on their website without getting sued for misleading a potential customer? And secondly, can you maybe walk through a little bit between the difference between ISO 27001 and SOC 2 and what the relative pros and cons are of those different types of certification?
Yeah, let me take the second question first, if I can. So ISO 27001 is an organizational standard. So what it does is it mandates the requirement and the build out of security maturity and governance over time for an entire organization. Sometimes that is sold a little bit disingenuously as, full assurance over the operating environment that that your data is going to be hosted in. And that's where people misunderstand it. It's an organizational standard. So it does set in basic requirements across the entire organization. And that is things like, you have good password management policies, and you have, security awareness programs and so on, all the good things that we know and love about these things. But what it won't say, for instance, in a cloud hosting environment that is platform as a service or infrastructure as a service, as clearly is where the responsibility of the cloud provider stops and where the customer's responsibility starts. And it's often in those areas where I think I see quite a lot of mis-selling of services as secure that in the end require some baking and thinking to meet security standard. And oftentimes, us at CyXcel, we're often on the coalface of that after a breach going, well, we sold you a service and you had to turn on monitoring or get your own MFA or do your own security thing. And it wasn't as clear to a customer who may not have the technical proficiency to understand these concepts. So that's what I'll say about assurances. I mean, ISO and SOC are similar but different. So the SOC 2 tends to be it's a US CPA regime. So it's a different regulatory regime, but oftentimes, it's recognized internationally. ISO tends to be an international, UK definitely recognized standard. Both of them have the same application in the sense that if they are assuring that a level of security is present, they offer you some assurance. What I'd say is both of them have a variable scope. So you need to look at the scope of applicability and make sure that the controls that you need to meet your regulatory obligations are embedded in the scope of applicability. So you can always ask your vendor, can you give me the scope of applicability for your ISO or for your SOC implementation? Because that will give you the idea, that will give you the set of controls that the independent auditor is testing and that the opinion pertains to. The other thing that's important to know on a SOC is that there's a SOC 2 type 1 and type 2. And a type 1 is just a single point in time. And often that I've seen that quite often presented as, we've got a SOC 2. But a SOC 2 type 1 is just something that we did when we launched the service. Now, a SOC 2 type 2 is an ongoing continual assurance vehicle. And that's a very different level and that's a very different level of cost as well. So look out for, you'll want in the long term a type 2 in the same way that ISO is an ongoing process. But you do have to with an ISO statement as well. You have to review the audit annually. You can ask your provider for those audits, and you should be looking at against any changes in scope. Try to probably build in changes in scope into your contract, and match those to any control requirements that you have. So there's a little bit of homework that each organization needs to do if you want to meet GDPR or NIST. You need to work out what controls would meet that.
That's it. So the big difference between SOC Type 1 and Type 2 is then that SOC Type 1 is just at one given point in time they pass the audit, whereas Type 2 is similar to ISO in the sense that it's renewed annually and there's a consistent process that they have to pass to be able to maintain that certification and display it in their sales and marketing material.
That's right. And coming back to the question, the topic so there are other assurances that are valuable as well. There's the CSA Star, which is good for cloud providers. There's a SOC 3, which is the answer to the question that I raised in the last question you asked me, which is if I've got a data center provider, I have a SaaS provider which sits on a data center provider. The data center provider doesn't want to provide me the SOC 2. They have the option of providing a SOC 3, which is just a general, statement. Not the detailed statement that a SOC 2 report provides, but a general statement that says, look, we've had this independently audited, and here's our attestation that it's reasonable, let's say. So, it is important if you're going to be procurement heavy to really understand these different mechanisms, because when we get down to having a conversation with a regulator, the level of conversation you can have and the due diligence piece, that's mandated in all the regulations. You must do your due diligence. This process of making sure they're certified and checking the statements of applicability that they apply to your operating environment and checking it annually to make sure that you address any changes. So as an example, in ISO, you could take out an encryption requirement in your ISO statement of applicability and still get your ISO certification. So if a vendor chooses to do that because they don't want to spend the money, you need to apply compensating controls to address that. Otherwise, your obligations are not met under the regulations. So that's really important, that due diligence part. Oftentimes, you procure the provider and off you go and you use them until there's a problem. And that That is not what the regulation says you ought to be doing.
Yeah, so digging under, like you said, digging under the hood to see what it actually covers to make sure that they've not omitted.
And the fact that it changes, it's an ongoing process, but you can change the scope. So, I think there's a really interesting data stat on procurement of cloud providers that, most will do their due diligence at the time that they purchased it, but not realizing that there's a couple of things that continue to change in the background once you've procured it. That is, they continue to develop the product and add new features all the time. And some of those could be insecure or cause security problems to you. And then the other is security as an example in the Microsoft contract's static. So once you sign a contract, they will always maintain a level no matter what the product is. But in other providers, that may not be as rock solid. And so you have to look under the hood and, they may descope some of that. So it just becomes expensive. It's like, well, where do you cut costs? Well, security is a great place if you're an operational service provider. So these are the things to look out for.
It's like reading your travel or your health insurance terms and conditions, isn't it? Of what is and what isn't included. It's very similar.
Yeah, T's and C's. That's right. It's T's and C's, and then actually understanding it, because oftentimes these changes in scope, it's a bit of an art to read a SOC 2 Type 2, because it's unlikely that they're going to publish something that has a damning material control violation. But there may be some discussions about some changes, and those might indicate some issues. So, I read one recently, post-breach actually, where we found a vendor that was an MSP, so a service provider for IT, that we think was responsible for a breach. And in fact, there was a statement in the SOC 2 Type 2 that said something along the lines of, we made a recommendation to management for them to improve their privilege access management control and not to use any generic accounts, that is, super user accounts with just a generic password on them. And in fact, that was the case during this particular breach. And so we're actually in the middle of testing that out in the courts, kind of going, well, we'd like to see what's under the hood. What was the actual basis of this recommendation? And we think actually there's a bit of a smoking gun there. It's like it feels like the auditor told you to fix this problem, and then suddenly my client got burned by this problem, and the gray area sits between what they are definitely accountable for and the client operating environment, which is why I always say, make sure that the statements of applicability extend to the operating environment that's hosting your data, and ask dumb questions about it, open-ended dumb questions, and get that documented.
Wow. Yeah, so much to consider, isn't it? So once you get under the hood, it's a bit of a can of worms. So that brings me quite nicely onto then the whole point of contracts. So if you're a buyer and you're buying not necessarily just software as a service, procurement tech, but any sort of IT product, what sort of contract clauses do buyers need to insist on to minimize their exposure to cyber risk?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's something we do a lot of thinking about. How do you, because in essence, what you're doing with a supplier is you're transferring some of the responsibility and risk. And that risk piece is not really transferable, I don't believe, unless you get a certain set of, a minimum set of clauses agreed in the contract. So the first is, the contract should have a minimum set of security controls. It should have these controls, and that should probably back off onto some kind of a standard. And that is, NIST or something. CIS is another, the Center for Internet Security. That's another good standard. And that is slightly different. That's a set of security controls that are operated around your environment. ISO is great as an organizational security piece, but you want something separate around your operating environment. SOC 2 is a little bit more data protection specific, so I'm going to give you some processing responsibilities, so you're going to get some assurance over that, and it has a lot of data protection controls around that. So the first is a minimum set of security controls. The second is independent attestation. So you should have an assurance clause, independent attestation of those controls. That is, I have a lot of conversations with third parties where they say, especially the smaller, newer ones come into the market saying, look, we're going to do our own testing and we're going to do our own code review. That's fine for the prep. As an example, for a SOC 2, you can do on your own prep if you feel like you've got that capability, but there should be some independent view that, an expert independent auditor that checks it. And I wouldn't recommend, and often there's a fusion over the right to audit clause being used in replacements. Often you'll see vendors say, well, we'll give you the right to audit. But in reality, as small businesses, do we feel like we have the ability to audit some of these big tech providers or the tech providers that they sit on? So you have a small cloud provider who has a little cool service that hosts on AWS or Azure. Azure is a big beast. I don't want to audit that anyway. And the configuration of Azure is a difficult task. And then the code implementation itself, I'm not sure that I have in fact, I worked with a regulator many years ago, and they kind of were arguing for the right to audit. And I kind of went, well, do you feel like you've got this is with the Microsoft Office 365 platform. Do you feel like you've got the ability to audit this thing? I probably wouldn't. So getting independent attestation requirement in the contract. And then you've got to think about...
And that's normally, that would normally be then mutually agreed by both parties who the independent auditor would be, or...
Well, less about who the auditor would be, but more about what the assurance vehicle would be and the scope of
what they would audit. Yeah.
Yeah. Specifically, we want these minimum controls audited against our operating environment plus ISO against the organization is a great statement.
Yeah.
And it can be under, in terms of, so minimum security controls, independent assurance and attestation, right to audit for exceptional circumstances. So in the case of a breach, you want to be able to kind of ask difficult questions and get the traction that you need. So if they have a breach and they notify you, and there's something that we use quite commonly, it's like, okay, we're announcing the right to audit and we're getting our experts in. We want to be read into the investigation and have a look at what you say is going on. And now they won't want to do that, but that's why that right to audit is important. It's a difficult one. And then the other is around, there's always going to be a conversation around limit of liability. Cloud providers will want to limit their liability to recovering to you. Let's say you're paying a monthly cost for the subscription. They'll say, fine, we agree to pay you back up to the level of the subscription cost for X number of months or whatever that is. I don't believe that's good enough. And we've had some successes recently, but I think if they are operating, and processing data on your behalf, as an example, then there should be something around an increase in that limit of liability if they are found to be having breached any one of those security controls materially. If they're found to be negligent in the way they operate that environment, then that limit of liability should be lifted. And you're not going to get that with the big providers like a Microsoft and so on. But to be honest, those hyperscale providers have proven that they're as secure as anything can be. It's more on the smaller provider. You want to really agree that it's fine. Look, we're going to trust you, but in terms of risk management, we're putting millions of pounds worth of our business on your environment, and we want some risk transfer in there. We want you to take a stake in that if you were found to be negligent. Because oftentimes what you find during post-breach investigation is the regulator has a look and goes, well, it's the operator, it's the service provider that was negligent, or actually it could often be the customer. The customer is often negligent as well. But, in a case where, you're putting some really critical crown jewels in terms of data and business onto this platform, you want to transfer some of that risk and you want that supplier to have a stake in. So that's an ideal. And then lastly, the thing you have to do is actually review those attestations because they're indications of change. Make sure the scope doesn't change. And that's the bit that I sometimes see on the customer side lacking. We got the attestation, we got the contract, it should be fine. This is enough. We'd like to think that outsourcing our problem is actually possible, wouldn't we? And the other thing I sometimes see is capital allocations or insurance requirements in the contract. So if you can negotiate a level of capital allocation, especially in the financial sector, that's handy.
Yeah, limitation of liability. As a procurement guy, that was always one of the toughest clauses in a contract to negotiate, because I get completely what you're saying, but no supplier wants to accept indirect or consequential loss. And, I, as a small business owner now, I would never accept that clause in any contract that I do business with. So it is a tricky one, but I completely get what you're saying that, the Microsofts and the SAPs of the world, they've proven themselves just by being as big as they are. But the smaller ones,
Well, this is where I say, you can get into bed with a Microsoft and know that, and as long as you use the software right, you should be as secure as anyone. What I see a lot with smaller businesses, they kind of go, well, Xero's too expensive, so we're going to go with a smaller provider. And, material, and I've got 2 clients doing this at the moment, material outsourcing or a back office or a system to the supplier. And if this supplier goes up in smoke or goes bankrupt or whatever that is, that's a big portion of the value of your business. And so you've got to think really carefully about that. So I have managed recently to negotiate a significant increase in the limit of liability only based on a material violation of those security controls. Well, what we're saying is, look, if you do your job right, we agree to this limit. But if we're found that you're negligent and the regulator and the investigation found you negligent, then you open yourself up to a suit where we can recover some of that funds.
Yeah.
It's tricky. We're talking about risk on both sides. Exactly to your point. I get it. There's a bunch of, but you got to back yourself as well. What service are you offering? Is it secure? Otherwise, you shouldn't be in the IT business now. It's tricky, I know. So I see both sides, and I often work on both sides as well. So there you go.
Alrighty, so I've learned a bunch on this today that I didn't previously know. Before I wrap it up, Jano, I'm just going to give you a couple of quick fire questions, a little bit of fun just to get to know you a little bit better before we close it out. So number one, if you could live anywhere in the world and money and jobs market and everything else that we take into consideration was no object, where would it be?
That's a tough question because I ask myself that a lot. Somewhere warm is the answer. Somewhere near the ocean. But somewhere that also, has all the perks that we come to know and love in some of the Western cultures, like stability of employment. So I haven't found that place yet, but I'm looking diligently.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, and then the final one is, what's your guilty pleasure? And the only rule here is that you have to keep it clean.
What's my guilty pleasure? I the older I get, the sweeter tooth I've got. So I have taken recently to have my morning cup of coffee with a shot of condensed milk in it.
Okay.
And it's really, really bad for you, I'm told.
Coffee with condensed milk. I've never actually tried it.
Yeah, it makes my day. So I think I haven't always been a sweet tooth, but I think in my aging, I have become more and more of and I suppose it's going to be more and more of that as I get older. I'm going to have to have more and more vices. I might eventually, pick up my vices as I get to the stage where it doesn't matter anymore. So there you go. The sweet tooth is the one I'm battling with.
Got it. So sweet tooth and condensed milk. That's a first. So awesome. Okay. So final question, Jano, before we sign off. If anyone would like to learn a little bit more about what CyXcel does, or maybe even they've got a case where they think you guys could potentially help out, where's the best place that we can send them to get in contact with you?
Yeah. Well, look, CyXcel.com. We've got a hotline number. So you can always call us directly. And it doesn't matter whether we have a pre-existing contractual relationship. We help clients. We did a lot of work in the insurance sector, so we get calls out of the blue from clients across the world, and they've got a problem, whether that's a massive data breach or whether that's their system is down and they're being posed with a £5 million ransom. We can help, and it doesn't have to be business hours. It can be any time, day or night. Usually, to be honest, it's always usually a Friday night. I don't know what it is about Friday night. It's a very popular time, so call us, CyXcel.com.
Got it.
And it doesn't have to be technical. It could be legal. Could be anything to do with cybersecurity. Just, it might even just be a suspicion. Sometimes it turns out to be nothing.
And I'll link to that in the show notes for anyone listening. Jano, pleasure having you on the show. Thank you for coming on and educating me a little bit more about this topic. And yeah, all the best.
Thanks for having me, James. Really, really enjoyed our discussion.
So that was hopefully Cybersecurity 101 for anyone out there who's looking to get a little bit more au fait with this topic. Perhaps you're sourcing software or looking for a procurement tech provider and want to be a little bit more clued up about what you need to ask for. We'll be back same time next month. If you want to get a weekly podcast, then don't forget to subscribe to my newsletter. Go to procurementsoftware.site/subscribe, because then you get my deep dive of the week every week as an exclusive podcast audio episode, as well as being able to read the newsletter. Catch you again, same time. Until then, take care wherever you are in the world, and bye for now.